It's Monday. That means another Religious Studies Project podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, David Robertson.
And I'm Christopher Cotter, and both David, myself, and the Religious Studies Project are presented to you in association with the British Association for the Study of Religions.
Indeed. Today's interview is with Jenny Butler, and it's by our good friend Christopher Cotter on the subject of Irish paganism in the 21st century. I think I'm just going to let that drop. Take it away, please.
Take a quick glance at typical religious studies curricula in schools and higher education institutions, particularly those guided by the logics of the world religions paradigm, and if you're lucky, you might just come across a passing reference to paganism buried amongst extensive references to Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and other, quote, world religions, unquote. This absence contrasts markedly with the fascination many of my own students have shown towards paganism, and with the prevalence of motifs which might be labelled pagan in Western popular culture. Arguably, both the seeming academic disregard and popular fascination with this topic are indicative of a superficial understanding of the broad range of phenomena to which the designation pagan can refer. Today, we're joined by a scholar whose work has made a significant contribution to fleshing out the category. Dr. Jenny Butler is a visiting lecturer in the Studies of Religion Department, University College Cork, and a member of UCC's Marginalised and Endangered Worldview Studies Centre, or MUSC. Her research interests include contemporary paganism, new religious movements, death studies, and Irish popular and folk religion. She's published widely on the topic of Irish paganism and is currently working on her book entitled 21st Century Irish Paganism, Worldview, Ritual, Identity, which will be published by Ashgate. And today, we're going to be discussing Jenny's work on paganism in Ireland, the impact of that particular context upon the paganisms she has researched, and hopefully some of the issues associated with the academic study of paganism in general. So first of all, Dr. Jenny Butler, welcome to the Religious Studies Project.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much for joining us, and listeners should probably be aware that I am experimenting with a Skype interview for the first time, so apologies for anything that might go awry, although my fingers are crossed. So before we get started, and this is a very broad question, but we can't just dive straight into your own research without first discussing what we might mean by paganism. Our listeners may be familiar with a previous RSP podcast with Ronald Hutton, which I'll just flag up, which focused largely on his book, The Triumph of the Moon, A History of Modern Pagan Witchcraft. But particularly, Jenny, within your own work, what are we meaning by this very broad term?
Well, paganism is a very broad term. It's an umbrella term for different kinds of nature-based religion or earth-centered spirituality. And the different kinds of paganism in paganism itself and in pagan studies are referred to as traditions or paths. And some scholars use the term paganisms, plural, as you mentioned there, to reflect the diversity of the different traditions. But I've chosen in my publications and in discussions of my work to say paganism, as this is the term that pagans use in a self-referential way. So I think if scholars are going to use paganisms, plural, they should also perhaps adopt the terms Christianities, Judaisms, and so on, as, you know, the mainstream or world religions are not monolithic either. And there is, for example, under the umbrella term of Christianity, there's Roman Catholicism, Orthodox Christianity, the different Protestant traditions, popular or syncretic forms of Christianity, and so on and so forth. So that's another reason why I use the term paganism. And because my research is ethnographic, I take heed of the internal definitions, to try and avoid imposing labels if possible. So my research focuses on Druidry, Wicca, and other forms of pagan witchcraft, and also participants who self-identify as pagan generically, without affiliating themselves with a particular path. So the traditions I'm researching each have their own history, and I'm examining their manifestations in contemporary Ireland. And to examine those manifestations, I look at what characterises the pagan worldview or belief system, and how that worldview is expressed through ritual and other activities, such as the creation and use of material culture, for example. And I'm also looking at art and how, the more imaginative means of expressing worldview through artwork. So there are many different forms of neo-paganism or contemporary paganism globally. And in Ireland, there's, for example, there's heathenism, shamanism, and diverse forms of Celtic spirituality. So for me, as an ethnographer, it was necessary to limit the analysis to certain traditions or paths, types of contemporary paganism, to give it a thorough portrayal of the worldview and activities. So at the outset of the research project, Druidry and witchcraft, including Wicca, seemed the most visible in Ireland. So I decided to focus on those. So my fieldwork involved interviews and participant observation with solitary practitioners, which are people who are not members of ritual groups. Also the groups, so that would be covens, which are ritual groups of witches, and groves, which are ritual groups of druids.
Wonderful. So we'll get to that fascinating research very shortly, but just and obviously I don't want this to turn into a kind of paganism 101, because as you highlighted there, we wouldn't just do a podcast on Christianity and be like, introduce Christianity right now. But the issue of relating paganism to the category religion is perhaps something that our listeners might be quite interested in. So, how does paganism fit with that category? Is it a religion?
Well, this is a much debated topic, I think. Paganism can't strictly be defined as a religion because there's not the uniformity of beliefs and prescribed practices as found in the major faiths. Many practitioners feel strongly that paganism is a religion, or that specific traditions or paths, the Druidry or Wicca, for example, are religions. But, there are many differences, and there's obviously the difference between the internal view, the practitioner view, and the academic view. Many pagans feel that the term pagan should be capitalized, for instance, when it's written, as it denotes a specific religion. So it should have a capital letter in the same way as Christianity or Islam, and paganism is generally defined as a nature religion in pagan studies. So in terms of what characterizes it, it's been variously described as animistic, pantheistic, or polytheistic. So it depends on how you're defining religion. But paganism is not a faith-based religion. And while there are things, kinds of beliefs and specific practices that are normally characteristic of paganism, the specific beliefs and practices of one practitioner can include all or none of those features. So it can be quite difficult to kind of put strict definitions. So it's important to convey the diversity within paganism and the fact that there are different spiritual paths that can vary widely in terms of belief and practice. And there are also eclectic pagans who merge different contemporary pagan traditions together, as well as incorporating other elements, sometimes from other cultural contexts. And it's important to say as well that some practitioners say that paganism is not a religion for them, but rather is a philosophy or a lifestyle. So their belief system informs how they live their life, but they don't regard it as a religion. So, even within paganism, there's debate about whether it's a religion or not. I think that many people, pagans and otherwise, regard religion as something different from spirituality. Associate the word religion itself with institutionalized religion. So Wicca might be the exception here in that it was founded as a mystery religion, and on initiation, one becomes a priest or a priestess of the Wiccan religion. So for Wiccans, that might be a different conversation. But in general, paganism has no official status as a religion in Ireland anyway. And it's decentralized, and there's no churches or temples in the sense of monotheistic religions. There is the Temple of Isis, which is in Clonegall, but that belongs to a specific organization, the Fellowship of Isis, which is an international goddess worship organization. So paganism, the umbrella term of paganism, there's no central authority or official clergy as there would be in the monotheistic religions. So they don't have official spokespeople in the media, for example. And also it's not a text-based religion. So there's no equivalent to the Bible or the Quran. And there are texts that might be sacred to individual pagans, like a Book of Shadows for Wiccans. But there's no text with an ancient provenance that contains rules to live by or anything like that. So paganism is a religion with no dogma. There are general ethical guidelines and beliefs depending on the specific tradition, but there's no dogma or a written creed. So due to these issues, like that paganism is not officially recognized as a religion in many countries comparable to the other religions, and the way that little is known about demographics or distribution patterns of practitioners across the population. We don't know the things about paganism. We don't have that data that we would have for other religions. So there are a lot of issues there with strictly defining it as a religion.
Absolutely. And in every definition, there's power plays and politics. Listeners are also directed to our interview with Suzanne Owen, where we specifically spent pretty much an entire interview discussing definitions of religion relating to Druidry in the UK. So before we get then to paganism in Ireland, just from your own work and your own research, if listeners are interested in sort of following up and getting a sort of paganism 101, as it were, are there any core sources to which you'd direct them?
Well, I think the Pomegranate, which is the International Journal of Pagan Studies, that's a peer-reviewed interdisciplinary journal specifically on the study of paganism, so that's quite a good resource. My research publications are all about paganism in Ireland, so they're listed on my profile on University College Cork's website. So I'm happy to give people copies of articles and things like that if they'd like to read them. Depending on the cultural or geographical context that people are interested in, you've mentioned Suzanne Owen on Druidry. There's Graham Harvey's work on paganism in the UK, Jenny Blaine's work on heathenism in the UK, Sabina Magliocco, she's written on witchcraft in the United States. There's also Sarah Pike's work on paganism in the US. Robert Wallace has published on contemporary shamanism. And you've Catherine Roundtree's work on witchcraft in New Zealand and paganism in Malta as well. And she's recently published an edited collection called Contemporary Pagan and Native Faith Movements in Europe, Colonialist and Nationalist Impulses. And there are various contexts examined in that collection. The history of paganism has been examined extensively by Ronald Hutton. I know I've already interviewed Ronald. So it depends on the area of interest and the geographical scope, I suppose. There's research done, of course, in Eastern Europe and so on.
Wonderful. And we'll certainly link to your institutional page and maybe some of those from the page accompanying this podcast. So you have alluded there to the particular different sort of geographical and national dynamics that might affect the way in which paganism is, I was going to say is manifest, but then that brings up sort of sui generis notions, but you know what I mean. So turning to paganism in Ireland then, I'm going to ask, which was one of your research questions for your PhD, I believe, just what characterizes the Irish pagan worldview?
Okay. Well, Irish pagan worldview can be characterized similarly to pagan worldviews globally, that most practitioners understand divinity as polytheistic. So most Irish pagans that I've interviewed believe in deities and spirits, and most also believe in magic, and practice magical rituals. And many would identify as animists. So you have that's a central aspect of Irish paganism. Irish paganism, the practitioners have a specific relationship with Irish cultural heritage. And this can be seen in the way that they select certain sites on the landscape as ritual loci, how they relate to mythology, and how they view history. So the global phenomenon of paganism, it adapts in form and content to different cultural milieus, as all religious traditions do. So in the Irish milieu, the beliefs and practices are informed by the vernacular cultural context and the indigenous religious traditions, as well as by what's understood to be Celtic heritage and the pre-Christian past. And the cultural setting shapes the worldview of Irish pagans. So things like the Irish language, the natural environment, the sacred sites, and mythology and history, as I said, they all have a bearing on the construction of pagan identities. So all of these cultural threads lend a feeling of, authenticity and a sense of place to contemporary pagans. And my PhD was in folklore and ethnology, so I'm quite interested in the use of tradition and identity construction and people's relationship with the past and heritage and so on.
So I'd be really keen if we could focus perhaps on the place of Ireland. And obviously we don't want to reify Ireland here. There's a lot of stereotypes people might have. Ireland as a particularly spiritual or mystical place. Ireland as a Catholic context. That kind of thing. So we weren't wanting to reify it, but you mentioned there Irish language, you mentioned the sort of Irish mythology and pantheon. So maybe you could draw out a couple of examples that, of this specifically sort of Irish form of paganism.
Yeah. The landscape and the mythology and the language are all interconnected in very complex ways. So the landscape, which is maybe one of the most important things for pagans, the land as both a physical location and an ideological sacred space. It's an important nexus between many different aspects of pagan culture. So the sacred sites are the locations for rituals and also gathering places for festivals and other events. And in Ireland, you have the Hill of Tara in County Meath, for example, Newgrange, which is also in County Meath. So there was the sacred centre of Meath, Mide. It was the fifth province in ancient Ireland. So a lot of the highly significant sites are there in that sacred centre, but also things like megalithic monuments, stone circles, and so on are important to lots of different groups and individuals. And the sites and the landscape itself are believed to be the dwelling place of local spirits, so the She or fairies and other magical entities, and also the source of divine, where you can encounter the divine or commune with the deities. So the land is the symbolic fabric that connects contemporary pagans with ancestral peoples who were considered practitioners of the same nature-based religion. And the natural world's sacred status is the motivating factor behind much environmental conservation work. And I've also covered the pagan protest to the M3 motorway being built through part of Tara. So, that the land is extremely important, and the sites and the landscape are connected to the mythology, the stories. So mythology is is another extremely important resource for pagans in both their discourse and their ritual practices. The deities of mythology for pagans are real entities that are venerated through ritual. So myths, in this sense, are sacred narratives, and they aren't just stories about gods or heroes, as they might be for non-pagans. So many pagans make reference to mythic symbols, or they tell mythological stories as having some relationship to contemporary, real life events, and interpret their experiences with encountering the divine during ritual. So they consciously engage with mythology, and they select symbols from the corpus of myth that might have spiritual significance for them personally. So some believe that the old gods of Europe have an independent, the old gods, that they have an independent existence on the spiritual realm, that they endured through time, and that people can communicate with them today. But not all pagans believe that. Some believe that mythological figures represent archetypes, so archetypal forces that can be, evoked in ritual contexts. So mythology is the main source material for information about deities and other beings, as well as insights into ancient culture. So, in terms of the Irish Celtic pantheon, it also gives insights into not only what ancient people believed about deities, but also insights into ancient culture. So despite the fact that Irish mythology was recorded after Christianization, so you have this Christian veneer on the stories, that the ancient, the motifs and the symbols are still there. So you do have something recorded that can connect people today to that past. So some forms of modern paganism identify as Celtic traditions, and they define this as venerating deities only from the Celtic pantheon. So some Irish groups only venerate Irish gods, goddesses, and the She, or the fairies. So it varies according to the groups or the individuals in question. Some people might include only Irish deities or gods connected to the Irish land, while others will look more broadly at the Celtic pantheon of Europe. So tied to the mythology and the land is also the language.
Yes.
And there are issues with language and identity. So there are pagans who are native speakers of Irish, and there's others who've learned to speak Irish because they feel it's important to speak the language in ritual. There are others who don't speak Irish, but they might include they've learned some phrases, for example, that they use to invoke deities, because they feel that that's the language that the gods would have, or that the gods speak or understand. So some people believe you should go back further to Old Irish. So consequently, they try to learn Old Irish, even if it's in terms of some phrases to address the deities. And there are some debates about the use of language in ritual, particularly. But again, this is tied to mythology and the place names and so on. And the pre-Christian heritage is, it's quite complex for pagans everywhere. And in the Irish context, there's maybe less information on the pre-Christian than elsewhere because of the way the mythology was recorded. One of the biggest sources is archaeology. So obviously it's quite hard to tell from archaeology what people might have believed,
Yes.
and like the detail of the belief. So the pagans generally tend to view the past in a selective way, and there's a tendency to focus on idealizing certain parts of history while excluding elements that are judged to be Christian. So they're excluded, and there's a more romanticized version of the past, and the kind of popular notion of the Celtic comes into play here a lot, because documented fact at times can be pushed aside in favor of a more mythic history or a more romantic idea of the past. So the correlations that pagans make between ancient religion and their own practices are often intended to be evocative of certain religious ideals rather than suggestions of, historical continuance. For instance, the way that many modern druids use the term grove, I mentioned that to you at the start there,
yeah.
as a ritual group of druids. That's a way of linking to the past, because the word grove can also be used in the sense of a woodland grove, like a copse. And in pre-Christian Ireland, the word that was used, the Latin, was nematon, which means a forest clearing, as being the location for druidical practices. So that, even the use of the word grove for groups of modern druids practicing their religion connects to sacred woodland, the idea of this ancient sacred woodland, and that has an emotional value rather than suggesting a historical development of druidry from ancient times. So sometimes it's more emotional or a spiritual connection rather than the historical. And druidry is an example of a revivalist tradition, because it makes claims to native cultural heritage, maybe more so than Wicca, because Wicca originated as a British initiatory tradition, so it was imported to Ireland, in the 1970s. So Wicca, the histories are different, obviously, but Wicca has also taken on local inflections or local flavour in Ireland, so to suit the cultural landscape. And there's the tradition of Celtic Wicca. So again, that would be this kind of a Celtic tradition that where individuals of the covens would only venerate the Celtic deities or the Irish deities. So a prominent notion in pagan discourse is the continuity of magical beliefs and practices through the ages. So you also have connections with maybe not with ancient times, but with pre-modern Ireland, or the native traditional Irish healers, for example, like the wise women and the cunning men of folklore. So folklore collections are another big resource for pagans when it comes to the cultural heritage that they're connecting with. So
fantastic. I'm going to have to jump in and sort of, we're almost out of time, which is fantastic, because we could clearly I could just push a button and listen to you for probably hours talking about paganism in Ireland. But obviously listeners are very much directed towards your research to find out more. We've just been able to give a very tantalizing introduction there, but just as we come to a close, you were mentioning there the sort of revisionism and how Irish pagans might trace their history and notions of historical continuity, etc. In terms of the place of the study of paganism within the academy, quite it wouldn't be inaccurate to say that it's maybe not been as respected as it might have been. It certainly in comparison with more quote established world religions unquote. So yeah, what's the intellectual context like for studying paganism? I believe that you're perhaps the first person to give this serious study in Ireland.
Yeah, as far as I know, yeah, I'm the only one who's done longitudinal research on paganism so far. In terms of the intellectual context, I think it's similar to elsewhere. There were a few hurdles to overcome, not least that of getting my MPhil proposal accepted by University College Cork, where the Academic Council evaluating proposals, in fairness, were open-minded enough to see the value of scholarship in this area. So I received a Government of Ireland scholarship in the Humanities and Social Sciences from the Irish Research Council for my doctoral research. So that funding body had the foresight to understand the cultural value of such a project. And pagan studies is even now a peripheral field within academia. And back when I proposed the project, it might have seemed rather out there as an idea. And so, it was really good that it got funded, and all the members of the folklore and ethnology department in UCC were extremely encouraging and supportive throughout my studies. So that was important as well. The departmental backing. And in terms of comparable research, I was on my own as a postgraduate student, and there was nobody else doing anything comparable. So it wasn't until I went to the Belief Beyond Boundaries conference at the Open University in Milton Keynes and the Alternative Spiritualities and New Age Studies conferences back in 2003 and 2004 that I saw that there was a growing subfield of religious studies called pagan studies. So that really helped. And there wasn't a comparable conference in Ireland until 2009 with the Alternative Spiritualities, the New Age and New Religious Movements in Ireland. So that was held at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. So the research area has been moving more slowly here.
Mm. And of course, as has come up in other podcasts, listeners should be aware that even the academic study of religion, as we would know it, is quite nascent in Ireland as well. So it's great to have your pioneering work within that sort of growing and nascent academic context. Just to finish up then, as most scholars of religion will be familiar with, when we engage in study, the study can have an impact upon the groups that we're studying. How have you found interaction with the pagan community in Ireland? Have you been aware of interpretations of your research, how it's been received? How's that been?
Well, it's been overwhelmingly positive. I give my articles to my research participants to read, especially where they've been quoted. So I know the community is aware of my work. But because my research is ethnographic and not historical, I don't think it would have the influence of, say, Ronald Hutton or other historians and archaeologists on the reconstruction of paganism. So I think I've had more impact in that I'm known as a folklorist. So sometimes pagans and other people as well ask me about specific traditions like festival celebrations, or they ask about other research projects that I've done, like on fairy belief, for example. So in that way, there might be snippets of information being incorporated in someone's ritual somewhere, but I can't really know that for sure. And I claim to be the only influence, as pagans as a demographic tend to be very well read, particularly about paganism and the history of their own movement. So I think that's a unique characteristic of paganism globally. But I think the impression I get is that they're happy that the profile of paganism in Ireland is being raised, and people have been very helpful to me, and in doing interviews and when I was doing participant observation and so on. So it's quite a positive response.
Excellent. And obviously that will be that impact might be hopefully significantly increased with your book that's on the way. What else is on the horizon for you?
Well, I founded the Irish Network for the Study of Esotericism and Paganism. So my plan is to organise some workshops and conferences and publications as well, hopefully, in the future, which will raise the profile of the area even more. And I'll also be teaching the first ever university course in Ireland on Western esotericism and new religious movements. So that might make a mark on the academic milieu here. So we'll see.
Perfect. Well, I'll certainly try and remember to flag those up on the page for the website as well. But that's been a whirlwind interview. It's been wonderful to have you. And yes, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that interview, Chris. Another excellent interview and very interesting. Nice to have more of our Irish context there. That's a few interviews we've had from Ireland now, and both interviewees and interviewers.
Yeah, and which is, reflecting also this sort of current move between the British Association for the Study of Religion and the Irish Society for the Academic Study of Religion to have a more collaborative relationship. We're very close both geographically and theoretically, so it's great that we're able to feature that. Also great that we're becoming a little bit of the Martin Lepage show at the moment. Last week's interview was with Martin. Next week's interview is with Martin, speaking with Anna Fideli on religion, gender and corporeality. But also, if you come back later in the week, we'll have a written response to my interview with Jenny Butler from Martin Lepage.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm looking very much forward to that. You're listening to the Religious Studies Project, of course, just now, but are you a subscriber to our emails?
You might not be, either just because you don't want your email list, your email inbox clogged up with more emails.
Which is one of the biggest blights on the life of an academic, or just most people nowadays, I think.
Yeah. Perhaps you thought our existing system wasn't sophisticated enough for you, or perhaps you just weren't aware that we actually had an email list. But Daniel Favand, our managing editor at the Religious Studies Project, has done a great job of setting us up with MailChimp.
Yeah, which basically means that a few things. One, you get flashy, good-looking emails rather than hastily typed monoscript emails with HTML and links to various podcasts and all these other features. Another exciting aspect is that you can choose the degree to which you receive the email. So if you want to get an email only for our Monday podcasts, you can do that. If you want to get our Monday podcast, the Opportunities Digest, and the responses, you can do that. Or if you'd prefer to get one email once a week as a digest of everything that the Religious Studies Project has put out over that week, you can do that too. And once subscribed, you can change these settings at any time. And there are links to do so and to unsubscribe completely in the unlikely event that you want to in each email.
Yeah, and so all you need to do to subscribe is go to our website, religiousstudiesproject.com, and look for the sort of follow box. You can just type your email in there, and then you'll get an email telling you all about how to set up your personalized settings. You'll also find details there of our Facebook page, our Twitter account, and our amazon.co.uk.ca and .com links, which you can use to support us at no extra cost to yourself when you are shopping on Amazon, if indeed you do.
Indeed. And our Facebook feed, manned or womaned, manfully by Venetia Robertson, our social media editor, is a great place to find out behind the scenes things about the Religious Studies Project, as well as the more interesting stories from the fringes of the religious world. And we've just passed 3,000 subscribers.
Yeah. So it's becoming quite a little hub in itself.
Yeah. So that's more of the community side. If you enjoy that kind of thing, then that's a good place to subscribe.
Yeah. But, thanks as ever to the BASR. And there's a final thing you to say is,
thanks for listening.